In honor of America's fighting forces, in memory of her heroes who fought and fell, in celebration of Armed Forces Day.
April 17th, 1942. The morning sun had barely climbed above the mountains outside Kunming when the warning sirens shattered the silence. Mechanics dropped their tools. Truck drivers abandoned their vehicles. Ground crews looked toward the eastern horizon. At first, no one saw anything. Then someone pointed into the distance. Tiny black dots. Dozens of them. Within minutes, binoculars confirmed everyone's worst fear. Japanese aircraft. Not 10. Not 20. Far more. The operations officer quickly counted the incoming formation. Bombers, escorted by fighters. Wave after wave. When the final estimate arrived over the field telephone, the room fell silent. 64 enemy aircraft. Against them, only a handful of American fighters remained operational. Among those pilots was Robert Lee Scott Jr., a member of the legendary Flying Tigers, later attached to the United States Army Air Forces. Their aircraft wasn't the newest fighter in the Pacific. It wasn't the fastest. It certainly wasn't the most advanced. The Curtiss P-40 Warhawk carried a reputation that divided military experts. Some praised its rugged construction. Others criticized its mediocre climb rate. Many believed it stood little chance against the agile Japanese fighters dominating the skies over Asia. The pilots knew something the critics often forgot. Airplanes didn't fight wars. People did. Scott climbed onto the wing of his P-40, while mechanics hurriedly finished loading ammunition. No one wasted words. Every man understood the numbers. 64 against a handful. It wasn't simply an uneven fight. It bordered on suicide. One young mechanic quietly asked, "Captain, are we really going up?" Scott looked toward the approaching aircraft. "If we don't." He paused. "They'll bomb everyone standing on this airfield." No one argued after that. Engines roared to life. The deep growl of the Allison engine echoed across the valley. Ground crews pulled away the wheel chocks. One after another, the P-40s accelerated down the rough runway. Heavy, loaded with fuel, loaded with ammunition. They lifted into the morning sky just as the first Japanese bombers crossed the distant mountains. From above, the situation looked even worse. The enemy formation stretched across the horizon. Twin-engine bombers occupied the center. Fighters circled above and beside them like guard dogs protecting a convoy. The Japanese believed victory was inevitable. Why wouldn't they? They possessed overwhelming numerical superiority. Many Japanese pilots had already accumulated years of combat experience over China. Several considered the American P-40 outdated before the battle even began. One Japanese officer reportedly remarked before a similar mission, "The Americans always fight hard, but they always fight alone." Scott studied the formation carefully. He ignored the bombers, ignored the fighters. Instead, he focused on the spacing. Military textbooks taught fighter pilots to attack directly. Dive. Fire. Climb away. Repeat. Against 64 airplanes, that approach guaranteed failure. He needed something else. Something unexpected. Something that would force the Japanese to stop fighting as one enormous formation. His wingman moved closer. "What are we hitting first?" Scott answered immediately. "Their confidence." The younger pilot looked confused. Scott never explained. Instead, he pushed the throttle fully forward. The P-40 surged ahead, straight toward the enemy. Inside the Japanese formation, several pilots noticed the approaching Americans. They counted quickly. 4, maybe 5 fighters. No more. The odds seemed almost laughable. One Japanese escort pilot actually smiled inside his cockpit. The Americans weren't attacking. They were sacrificing themselves. Or so he believed. Scott continued closing the distance. His wingmen expected him to choose one of the bombers. Instead, at the very last moment, he pulled sharply upward. The Japanese formation hesitated. Only briefly, but that hesitation would change everything. Rather than attacking the bombers, Scott flew directly through the narrow gap separating the escort fighters from the bomber formation. The maneuver made no sense. At least, not at first. Japanese fighter pilots instinctively turned toward him. Bomber pilots instinctively tried to maintain formation. Within seconds, the perfectly organized formation began stretching apart. Tiny gaps appeared, then larger ones. Communication broke down. Pilots started reacting individually instead of collectively. Exactly what Scott wanted. He had no intention of fighting 64 airplanes. He intended to make 64 airplanes stop fighting together. Behind him, the other P-40s immediately exploited the confusion. Instead of attacking one massive wall of aircraft, they suddenly found isolated bombers, separated fighters, small groups vulnerable to quick hit-and-run attacks. The Japanese numerical advantage hadn't disappeared, but their organization had. And in aerial combat, organization often mattered more than numbers. The first bomber burst into flames only seconds later. Then another fighter broke formation. Another bomber turned away unexpectedly. The carefully planned Japanese attack was beginning to unravel. Not because of firepower, not because of superior aircraft, because one pilot had recognized that destroying the enemy's plan could be more important than destroying the enemy himself. The battle above China had only just begun, and before it ended, every pilot in the sky, American and Japanese alike, would witness a tactic few had ever imagined. April 17, 1942, at nearly 18,000 feet above the mountains of western China, the carefully organized Japanese formation was beginning to unravel. Only seconds earlier, every bomber had been protected by overlapping rings of escort fighters. Now, pilots were reacting individually. Some chased the American fighters, others remained with the bombers. Several commanders desperately tried to restore formation over the radio. The sky had become chaotic, exactly as Captain Robert Lee Scott Jr. had hoped. He knew something every experienced combat pilot eventually learned. A large formation was only dangerous as long as it behaved like one. Break its rhythm, and every airplane became responsible for its own survival. Scott rolled his Curtiss P-40 Warhawk into a steep dive. His sights settled on the nearest twin-engine bomber. He didn't open fire immediately. He waited. Closer. Closer. Only when the bomber completely filled his gun sight did he squeeze the trigger. 6.50 caliber machine guns erupted simultaneously. Bright streams of tracer rounds ripped through the bomber's left engine. Panels flew apart. Black smoke poured backward. The Japanese aircraft suddenly lurched sideways. Its formation dissolved as neighboring bombers swerved to avoid collision. Scott never looked back. His attack wasn't about confirming kills. It was about creating another problem for the enemy commander. One damaged bomber forced 3 others to maneuver. 3 maneuvering bombers forced fighters to reposition. Every reaction created another opening. His wingmen immediately exploited them. Lieutenant Charles Older dove on another bomber from above. A short burst shattered its cockpit canopy. The aircraft rolled sharply before disappearing into the clouds below. To the Japanese crews, the situation no longer made sense. There were too few American fighters. Far too few. Yet they seemed to appear everywhere at once. One bomber radio operator repeatedly transmitted frantic warnings. Enemy fighters above. Seconds later, enemy behind us. Enemy behind us. Then, they're below now. From inside the formation, it felt as though the Americans were multiplying. They weren't. They were simply refusing to stay where Japanese doctrine expected them to be. Rather than circling in traditional dogfights, the P-40s attacked once, then disappeared. Another pass. Another burst. Gone again. Always moving. Always choosing the moment of contact. Never allowing the escorts to surround them. The tactic demanded tremendous discipline. Every instinct told fighter pilots to chase a damaged enemy until it fell. Scott resisted that temptation. Destroying one airplane meant little. Destroying the formation meant everything. His radio crackled. "Bandits on your 6. Without hesitation, he rolled inverted. 3 Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa fighters were closing rapidly. Their lightweight construction allowed astonishing maneuverability. Trying to outturn them would be suicide. Scott had no intention of trying. Instead, he pushed the nose downward. The P-40 accelerated like a stone. Its heavier construction, often criticized by aviation experts, suddenly became an advantage. The Japanese fighters followed. For several seconds, all 4 aircraft plunged toward the mountains. The airspeed indicator climbed higher and higher. The controls grew heavier. The engine roared. Then, Scott leveled out only a few hundred feet above a river valley. The Japanese pilots attempted to follow, but they faced a difficult choice. Continue diving and risk structural failure, or pull up and abandon the chase. 2 climbed away. The 3rd stayed. Scott smiled. He had expected that. The P-40 wasn't the most agile fighter in the sky, but it could absorb punishment and maintain high-speed dives remarkably well. Many Japanese pilots underestimated exactly how much speed the American fighter could carry through a maneuver. Scott suddenly pulled into a climbing turn. Not a tight turn. A wide one. The Japanese pilot eagerly followed. Then Scott did something unexpected. He reduced power. Only slightly. The pursuing fighter closed the distance much faster than anticipated. For an instant, the Japanese pilot overshot. It was all Scott needed. He shoved the throttle forward again. The P-40 surged ahead. Its nose swung directly behind the surprised Japanese aircraft. A brief burst of machine gun fire flashed across the sky. The fighter rolled sharply. Smoke streamed from its engine before it disappeared beneath the mountain ridges. Scott transmitted calmly over the radio. "Don't chase. Hit them and move." The message reached every American pilot. Again and again, the P-40s repeated the same pattern. Attack. Separate. Disappear. Return from another direction. The Japanese numerical advantage remained overwhelming. But numbers alone meant little when nobody could predict where the next attack would come from. Meanwhile, below them, civilians in Kunming watched the battle unfold. From the ground, the sky appeared filled with twisting vapor trails and tiny flashes of gunfire. Many expected the city to be devastated. Instead, the bombers struggled to maintain their planned course. Every few minutes, another formation drifted off target. Some released bombs too early. Others jettisoned them simply to gain speed against the relentless American attacks. The Japanese mission commander realized something disturbing. The bombers were no longer concentrating on bombing. They were concentrating on surviving. His carefully coordinated strike had become a collection of isolated emergencies. He ordered the escort fighters to regroup. But the order arrived too late. Each section believed another section was already covering the bombers. Some escorts chased American fighters dozens of miles away. Others remained too close to react effectively. Communication became increasingly confused. Fuel calculations suddenly became a concern. The longer the battle lasted, the farther every aircraft drifted from its planned route. Scott noticed another opportunity. The bombers were beginning to turn home. Their escorts instinctively tightened around them. Not because they wanted another fight, because they wanted to leave. He gathered the remaining American fighters with a simple instruction. One last pass. The P-40s climbed into the sun. For several moments, they disappeared against the bright morning light. Japanese lookouts scanned desperately. Nothing. Then one gunner shouted, "Above." Too late. The Americans descended almost vertically. Machine guns hammered. Another bomber staggered from formation trailing thick black smoke. A second aircraft peeled away with one engine burning. The escorts finally managed to intercept the attackers, but by then, the Americans had already broken away once again. The Japanese formation continued eastward, not in triumph, in disorder. Below, the airfield at Kunming remained standing. The runways were scarred by only a handful of bombs. Fuel depots still burned in isolated places, but the devastating destruction Japanese planners had expected never materialized. The Flying Tigers hadn't destroyed all 64 aircraft. They hadn't needed to. They had destroyed something far more valuable: the enemy's ability to fight as a single force. Hours later, after landing, Scott climbed from his cockpit covered in sweat, oil, and gunpowder residue. A mechanic hurried toward him. "Captain." "How many did we get?" Scott removed his flight helmet and looked back toward the mountains where the battle had disappeared. Then he answered quietly, "I wasn't counting airplanes. I was counting minutes." The puzzled mechanic frowned. Scott smiled. "Every minute we kept them confused was another minute they weren't bombing our people." The lesson would stay with every pilot who heard it. Sometimes the greatest victory in the air wasn't destroying the enemy. It was making him forget why he came in the first place. The Japanese formation was retreating, not in panic, not in complete defeat, but no longer as the disciplined striking force that had crossed the mountains only an hour earlier. The mission had been simple: destroy the airfield, cripple the American fighters, break Chinese resistance in the region. Instead, the bombers were returning with damaged aircraft, scattered formations, and crews still trying to understand what had happened. From the cockpit of his Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, Captain Robert Lee Scott Jr. watched the enemy disappear toward the east. His fuel gauges were falling rapidly. His ammunition boxes were nearly empty. His airplane bore fresh bullet holes across one wing. Only then did the adrenaline begin to fade. He took a long breath. The battle was over, or so he thought. A warning suddenly came across the radio. "Single fighter, high right." Scott instinctively looked upward. One Japanese fighter had remained behind, whether separated from the formation or deliberately searching for a final opportunity, no one knew. The aircraft rolled into a steep attack. Scott immediately recognized the danger. His own airplane had little ammunition left. The Japanese pilot likely assumed the American fighter was equally exhausted, perhaps even damaged enough to finish easily. It was exactly the kind of mistake Scott hoped his opponent would make. Rather than climbing to meet the attack, he continued flying almost straight. His wingman shouted over the radio, "Brake." Scott didn't. The Japanese pilot interpreted the steady course as hesitation, or fear. He committed completely. The distance closed rapidly. 200 yards. 150. Then, Scott shoved the throttle forward and pushed the P-40 into a shallow dive. The heavy fighter accelerated immediately. The Japanese pilot followed, exactly as expected. Instead of trying to outturn his opponent, a contest the lighter Japanese fighter usually welcomed, Scott transformed the fight into something entirely different: a race. The P-40 had always possessed one advantage its critics often ignored. It could dive extraordinarily well. Its rugged construction allowed pilots to carry tremendous speed through maneuvers that made lighter aircraft increasingly uncomfortable. The airspeed climbed. 300 miles per hour. 350. Nearly 400. The valley rushed beneath them. Trees blurred into streaks of green. The Japanese pilot remained committed, too committed. Scott suddenly pulled into a long climbing arc. Not violently. Smoothly. Patiently. The Japanese fighter tried matching the maneuver. But after such a fast dive, energy management became everything. The lighter aircraft bled speed more rapidly. Its climb slowed. Scott's heavier fighter continued upward with surprising momentum. For one brief moment, the Japanese aircraft appeared suspended against the blue sky, exactly where Scott wanted it. He squeezed the trigger. Nothing. His ammunition was gone. The machine guns remained silent. Many pilots would have broken away. Scott didn't. Instead, he kept charging directly toward the Japanese fighter. The enemy pilot had no way of knowing the American guns were empty. At the last possible second, he rolled away violently. Scott smiled. Sometimes confidence was as powerful as ammunition. The Japanese pilot abandoned the engagement entirely. Moments later, he disappeared toward the retreating formation. Years afterward, Scott reflected on encounters like that one. People often imagined aerial combat as a contest of reflexes. Fast hands, sharp eyesight, perfect marksmanship. Those qualities certainly mattered. But they weren't enough. The greatest fighter pilots thought several moves ahead. They shaped battles before the first shot was fired. That morning above China, Scott had done exactly that. He never intended to destroy 64 airplanes. Such a goal would have been impossible. Instead, he attacked the enemy's assumptions. Japanese commanders expected American fighters to defend the airfield directly. Scott attacked their organization. Japanese escorts expected prolonged dogfights. Scott refused to stay and fight. Japanese bomber crews expected predictable interception tactics. Scott attacked from unexpected directions. Every decision forced the enemy to react instead of execute. By the time the Japanese realized what was happening, the bombing mission had already unraveled. Back at the airfield, mechanics counted fresh holes in every returning P-40. Some aircraft carried dozens. One mechanic reportedly shook his head while inspecting Scott's fighter. "I've seen airplanes with less damage after crashing." Scott laughed. "As long as it landed, it's still a good airplane." The ground crews worked without pause. Bullet holes were patched. Oil leaks repaired. Machine guns reloaded. No one knew when the next raid would come. There was little time to celebrate. Still, word of the battle spread rapidly. Chinese civilians gathered outside the airfield. Many had expected to witness destruction. Instead, they saw battered American fighters returning one after another, scarred, smoking, but returning. Children waved. Workers applauded. Older villagers silently removed their hats. For them, the battle represented far more than another military engagement. It proved the Japanese Air Force could be resisted. Hope, after years of relentless bombing, had returned to the skies. Military intelligence later reconstructed the engagement. The Japanese had launched a powerful force believing overwhelming numbers guaranteed success. Instead, poor coordination under unexpected pressure had dramatically reduced the effectiveness of that advantage. Historians would later point out an important lesson. Numerical superiority alone rarely guarantees victory. Leadership, discipline, flexibility, those often matter more. The Flying Tigers became legendary not because they possessed superior aircraft. In fact, many Japanese fighters could outclimb and outturn the P-40. Their success came from understanding exactly what their airplane could and could not do. They avoided turning contests, used diving speed, protected one another, struck quickly, then vanished before the enemy could respond. It was disciplined combat rather than reckless heroics. That philosophy would influence American fighter doctrine throughout the Pacific War. Later aircraft such as the North American P-51 Mustang and the Lockheed P-38 Lightning benefited from similar principles. Fight on your own terms, never on the enemy's. Robert Lee Scott Jr. would finish the war credited with multiple aerial victories and become one of America's best-known fighter aces. Yet when journalists later asked him about dramatic dogfights, he often emphasized something unexpected: preparation, discipline, thinking. He believed courage without judgment accomplished little. The battle over Kunming illustrated exactly why. The newspapers later described the engagement as a desperate victory against impossible odds. Pilots who had been there described it differently. One veteran later said, "We didn't beat 64 airplanes. We beat one bad plan." Perhaps that was the greatest lesson of the day. History often celebrates the loudest victories, the biggest explosions, the highest scores. But some of the most important triumphs happen quietly. A commander recognizes a weakness no one else sees. A pilot refuses to fight the battle his enemy expects. A handful of aircraft delay a force many times their size. And an airfield that should have been destroyed lives to fight another day. Because sometimes the most remarkable weapon in the sky isn't a faster engine or bigger guns. It's a pilot who understands that confusing an enemy can be far more devastating than simply shooting at him. That April morning over China, dozens of Japanese aircraft returned home believing they had faced far more fighters than actually existed. They hadn't. They had encountered something much rarer, an opponent who understood that the quickest way to defeat a superior force was to make it stop acting like one.